witch hat on. Hiya kittens. It's my inaugural spooky historical story time. I don't know. I'm trying something. I'm new here. Hello. I'm new. Hello and welcome. It's Halloween and I wanted to share a spooky, horrifyingly real story with you that a lot of people don't know about, and I think that's awful. Frankly, it's awful that the story has just managed to completely be ignored. There've been a couple books, most recently the book that I read that gave me the majority of this research, and but like, it's a horrible story. It's creepy, it's gross, it's really sad, and I thought it'd be great for Halloween 2020. You're welcome. Anyways, it runs a little long, so it's probably going to be cut into 2 parts because it is a little bit long, but I hope you enjoy it. Stick around. So I guess let's get to it. In Europe, during La Belle Époque, a new element had been discovered. It was beautiful and had magical properties. It could put roses in your cheeks and give you long life, and it was considered a cure-all from curing blindness, impotence, eczema, asthma, acne, dandruff. They injected this into everything they could think of. No matter how minute the amounts, if the product claimed to have its magical properties, then the products flew off the shelf. Once it made its way across the ocean to America, it even became a song in the hit musical Piff, Paff, Pouf. That's a show that has never been remounted as far as I know, and frankly I know nothing about it, but the name alone. It's good stuff. Piff, Paff, Pouf. They put it in everything. Gosh, they put it in everything. Not unlike fat-free or gluten-free today, water has always been gluten-free, but now it's guaranteed gluten-free, and you can pay the $10 for the privilege of knowing that your water is pure. Commercialism. That's nice. Dubbed Liquid Sunshine, they made lipsticks and face creams with it, mixed it with chocolates and health tonics, and chicken feed to improve the egg. They embedded it into fabric to make jock straps and lingerie. They bottled it and sold it as a spray that quickly kills all flies, mosquitoes, and roaches, has no equal as a cleaner of furniture, porcelain, or tile. It is harmless to humans and easy to use. It was mixed into paint and used in watch and clock dials, and here begins our story. With the onset of World War I, the need for watches that you could see at night was huge. Being able to read and synchronize your watch without a flickering flame from a match or a lighter to draw attention to your location in the trenches was one of those things you don't realize is actually really important. Okay, so what did they use? Well, it's not like watch batteries had been invented. People were just getting used to the idea of electricity and telephones in their homes. So that's where this beautiful glowing new element, metal, chemical, that's why it was such a big deal. In December of 1898, Madame Curie and her husband discovered the element radium. It would take her until 1910 to isolate metallic radium. And after that, it only took humans 4 more years to synthesize it and turn it for profit. Capitalism. I can't find any decent information on why they thought it was such an amazing discovery, except that it produced its own glow and it was its own heat source, and with the first few studies showed that it could cure some forms of cancer. And those who had any dealings with it did find that at the beginning they felt incredible. Extra energy, clearer skin, brighter eyes, quicker brains. So I suppose naturally with 1 week or 1 month or even 1 year of exposure to it, you might think it was a cure-all. The fountain of youth. Today, because we have learned, we've all seen at least one sci-fi show where someone finds something that glows and they're just completely entranced by it, and only later they find out that it's actually a malevolent being or glowing octopus poop. We likely wouldn't jump to injecting it into our bodies as a cure-all, but maybe. What is radium? According to Ducksters.com, elements for kids, don't judge. Under standard conditions, radium is a silvery metal. It is very radioactive, emitting light rays that cause it to glow in the dark. When exposed to the air, it will quickly form a black coating by reacting with the nitrogen in the air. It also reacts readily with other elements and substances, including water. Humans are like 70% water. We're basically cucumbers with anxiety, no? The radiation given off by radium is extremely dangerous. It is over 1 million times as radioactive as uranium. Radium is an extremely rare element on Earth. It is found in uranium ores. It takes about 7 tons of ore just to produce a single gram of radium. It is produced as a byproduct of uranium mining. Because it's so dangerous, only a few ounces are produced a year. Let's go back to watches. So World War I. Women were only just being allowed into the workforce. They still didn't have the right to vote or hold property, and therefore had very little autonomy. The work the average woman would find was often in factories as seamstresses, laundresses, factory work. The lucky and educated women, they were often able to find a position in an office or as a domestic servant, but those positions were pretty rare, and like most jobs in the industrial era, the work was hard and unglamorous and paid a pittance, because of course a woman couldn't make more than a man. Well, she was only there temporarily because eventually she would marry and become a wife and, God willing, a mother. So women weren't serious about work, it was simply a dalliance on their way to the altar. I digress. The point is that watch painting existed before the war, and a handful of women worked it to make the 100 or so watches sold each year. By the time the war started in Europe in 1914, they hired more women to paint the watches and gun sights and compasses. By the time America joined the war, they had hired thousands of women and were producing millions of watches. The women weren't salaried, they were paid for each dial they completed at an average of 1.5 cents a watch. Some women could walk away at the end of the week with $20 to $40, making their annual income nearly $2,080, which maybe today you don't consider to be that big of a deal, but if we switch it around, it's approximately 40,000 US dollars. These unmarried women were making bank. It was also a really social job. You showed up for work, collected your watches, and then sat at your desk and chatted with the other girls. It was fun. There was only 1 or 2 matrons watching over you, and there were rarely any men on the floor. If a job today were to offer me the same thing, painting something mindless, making a lot of money and being able to hang out with my friends, yeah, I'd do it. So you're a 20-year-old woman who has never had anything of her own. Any allowance you may have received likely came from a father, or brother, or uncle. If you were married, it came from your husband. But now you have the ideal job, plenty of spending money, and still able to save for a nest egg, or to fill your hope chest. Maybe you're finally able to move out of your family home and live on your own. Something terribly rare for girls, because of course that meant you were unchaperoned. And unchaperoned women are dangerous, because we're wild. Having a job back then was like getting a car now. You level up in your feeling and sense of independence. In the morning, the girls would come into work, head to the matron or an instructress, and receive their first tray of 24 or 48 watch dials and their crucible. I know, right? Crucible. They had such fancy words for bowl back then. With their dish of fine powdery radium, which was measured and doled out, just a small amount really, little dab will do ya, mixed with the paint, they would begin the day. Sit down at their desk, grab their fine camel hair paintbrush to accommodate for the smallest pocket watch that they painted, where the smallest element to be highlighted measured no more than 1 millimeter thick. Then they would trace the number. Some girls would get through the whole digit without the paint drying or needing to reload their brush. Some would get through 2, and some would have to fix their brush multiple times per number, the hair splitting as the paint dried, causing messiness that you could be reprimanded for. Solution? Pop the bristles into your mouth, twirl the handle, and slip it back out, and you have a freshly pointed brush, ready to dip back into the material for the next number on your dial. Lip, dip, paint. 12 numbers on a dial, potentially 6 to 48 times you might slip the radium-coated paintbrush between your lips to point it for better accuracy per watch. It didn't taste like anything, but the texture was unpleasant, grainy. Some of the women questioned the method and were told it's absolutely splendid. There is no need to be afraid. It will make you healthy and put roses in your cheeks. Whether literally or figuratively, that's a weird thing to say about paint. The radium, or the material, as the ladies called it, was so fine it floated in the air around them, covering everything in the workroom. It settled in their hair, on their clothes, and eyelashes. As they painted the watches, no matter how delicate they were with mixing, flashback was inevitable and would get on their hands and smocks. Once a tray was complete, they would bring it to the lady inspectors, who would check their work in a dark room. Void of light or windows, they could see exactly where the material had landed. The women glowed. The powdered material was precious, really expensive, and at the end of their shifts they would be summoned to the dark room to be brushed down, and the fallen particles would be swept up to be used the next day. Yep, the particles would be brushed from them, land on the floor, and then swept up and added to tomorrow's paint, which they would then put their brushes into and put it into their mouths. On the whole, this is not the most worrying thing about this story, but it's still nauseating nonetheless. But no amount of brushing would remove the majority of the material. Hands, arms, neck, the dresses, the underclothes, even their corsets were luminous. When they would go home at night, their clothing would shine in the dark. You could see where they were. They glowed like ghosts as they walked home. Everyone noticed. They were unmissable. Not just their luminescence, but also the expensive and fashionable clothes they wore. It was the job to have for the poor working girl. The women were humorously termed the ghost girls. It wasn't a job for everyone. Many women didn't like the feel of the gritty paint in their mouth, chewing the dried paint off the brush before dipping it back into the dishes. One woman complained of mouth sores and so she quit, but otherwise no one thought anything of it. When one painter, Catherine Schaub, who had started working for the watch style industry in 1917, had a breakout of pimples in her usually creamy complexion, wondered if her job was linked to her skin eruption. She went to her doctor. Her doctor asked if she worked with phosphorus and took a blood sample. Phosphorus was by this time a well-known industrial poison and had led to such disfiguring manifestations as Fossy jaw. But to Catherine's knowledge, there was no phosphorus component to the paint. The doctor chalked her breakouts up to hormones. She was only 15. But he did know that there were changes in her blood. Catherine returned to the factory and told the girls what the doctor had said. They confronted their manager, who went to his managers, and finally the head honchos came to the factory to tell the women there's nothing hazardous in the paint. The doctors promised the radium was used in such a minuscule amount that it could not cause them harm. By 1920, only 3 years from the start of working with the Radium Luminous Materials Corporation, Catherine Schaub was feeling tired and run down. She'd also noticed a funny cracking and stiffness of her legs. Odd for someone who's only 18. Several of Catherine's former colleagues were also noticing odd complaints and minor health problems. Largely they were tired. Hazel Vincent thought she was working too hard, so she left and got a job elsewhere. But her energy levels didn't improve, and she was losing weight. She felt weak and her jaw ached horribly. In 1921, 23-year-old dial painter Molly Maggia was suffering from constant tooth and jaw aches. Her dentist had already removed one tooth, and they couldn't understand why a month later the hole in her mouth and gums wasn't healing. She was referred to a different dentist who specialized in mouth and jaw issues, hoping they would be able to help. The doctor observed her flamed gums and loose teeth and diagnosed and treated her for Peoria. Peoria, or periodontitis, is an inflammation of the tissue and the gums surrounding the teeth, causing the gums to shrink and the teeth to loosen. But instead of improving, Molly got worse. The new dentist removed more teeth, but none of the extractions ever healed. Instead, more ulcers grew in the holes left behind, oozing pus and filling her mouth with a foul odor. Next came the pains in her hips and her feet. Doctors diagnosed rheumatism and administered aspirin and rest. As for her teeth, they started to just fall out on their own. Her mouth was quite literally disintegrating. Doctors were at a loss for what was happening, but they pieced together what they thought was a reasonable explanation. Syphilis. Sores in her mouth, joint pain, extreme fatigue, and a woman living outside the safety of her family home. Clearly, she had a sexually transmitted disease. However, one doctor, Dr. Neff, depends if you pronounce the K, I suppose, who had previously diagnosed her with Peoria, was noticing certain things about her case that made him doubt his original hypothesis and the syphilis. He speculated that it seemed the affliction was attacking her from inside, the unstoppable disintegration of her mouth, and the smell of decay that is usually associated with forms of necrosis of the jaw. His new theory was that she was suffering from a condition not unlike phosphorus poisoning. He decided to visit the factory and studio, and though they weren't particularly helpful, they informed him that no phosphorus was used in the factory. Performing his own test, though I'm not entirely sure what that means, if he stole a sample of paint, perhaps tested her blood and tissues looking for phosphorus poisoning, I don't know. He concluded that the factory was correct. There was no use of phosphorus in the paint. So by now, Molly was in constant agony. Her mouth was a mass of sores, she could barely speak, and she couldn't eat. She quit her job at the factory. In May of 1922, Molly returned once again to Dr. Kneff's office so he could see what progress had been made. When Molly sat in the chair and opened her mouth for Dr. Neff to examine, gingerly began probing and touching her jaw, and to his horror and shock, the jawbone broke against his fingers, and then he just reached in to her mouth and pulled it out, because I'm assuming the entire inside of her mouth was just raw and open. It was just an open wound inside of her mouth. A week later, the remainder of her jaw was removed in the same way. Dr. Knapp began to realize that with each removal of affected bone, the speed of necrosis sped up rather than slowed or stopped. Every tooth he had pulled had made her worse. On September 12th of 1922, the infection that had attacked Molly's teeth and jaw had now spread to the tissues of her throat and slowly ate its way through her jugular, filling her mouth with blood. She hemorrhaged so fast, no one could do anything to help her. She was 24 years old, and her death certificate said syphilis. It was November of 1922, and more women were reporting illnesses to their doctors and dentists. Irene Rudolph, cousin of Catherine Shaw, was unknowingly following in Molly Maggia's footsteps, each time her dentist removed a tooth or part of her jaw because it too was disintegrating. The situation became worse. By December, she was found to be extremely anemic. She was admitted to a local hospital. She'd had enough and wanted answers. Word got around after Molly's death that syphilis had killed her. Anyone who knew Molly knew that that was untrue. So when Irene had the opportunity, she told her doctor about Molly, and then she shared news of Hazel. Hazel, who had left Radium Luminous Materials Corporation, now United States Radium Corps, or USRC to save our mouths. Due to extreme exhaustion, she hadn't found respite. She became more and more ill, told she was suffering from anemia and Peoria, and suspected Fossey jaw. She had a black discharge and garlic smell that oozed from her jaw and her nose. Irene saw similarities between hers and Molly's cases and wanted her doctors to do the same. Whatever she said worked because they listened and believed her and concluded that whatever was afflicting the women was occupational. Imagine that. A doctor in 1922 believing a woman when she says that something's wrong. Did you know that today, in 2020, 50% of women are likely to be misdiagnosed following a heart attack, 30% of women are likely to be misdiagnosed following a stroke, or have their condition overlooked entirely? It takes approximately 5 years for a woman to be diagnosed with an autoimmune disease and have it correctly identified, and female-specific conditions like endometriosis, fibroids, etc., they take about 10 years for a more accurate identification and diagnosis. Those numbers change dramatically if you're a woman of color or an indigenous woman. It has been 100 years, medical people. Get your shit together. So, her doctor filed a report to the Industrial Hygiene Division, and within days an inspector was sent off to the plant. And while he was there, he observed the women lip pointing. The inspector called it to the attention of the vice president of the company, who claimed that the girls had been warned repeatedly not to use the technique, but they refused to stop. Liar! Liar! The inspector concluded the investigation by taking a paint sample with him for testing and sent it off to a chemist. The chemist discovered no phosphorus in the mix and concluded the issues were caused by the influence of radium. A few weeks later, an additional investigation occurred with a different inspector and a different approach. As no health issues had been reported to the company itself, she concluded that whatever was causing the disintegration of teeth and jaw was coincidental and not occupational. But it would seem the chemist was in the know, because USRC had just a few months earlier published an article, Radium Dangers, Injurious Effects. And incredibly, had articles in the bibliography dating all the way back to 1906 on the damages radium could cause, including the death of a woman in Germany who had been treated with radium by her doctor. Cause of death? Radium poisoning. So why was radium considered so great then if they knew how bad it was? Capitalism. But also, the people writing the pro-radium articles and publications were largely funded by the radium firms themselves. Many firms had their own radium-themed journals, which were distributed free to doctors full of optimistic research. Kind of like drug reps nowadays, or Monsanto. By the end of 1923, dial painters were dying off at alarming rates. No one knew the cause of death, and each had something different on their death certificates. From Molly Maggia's syphilis and Helen Quinlan, who at 22 years old was given Vincent's angina as the cause of death, a painful and progressive bacterial disease that begins in the gums and steadily spreads until the tissues in the mouth and throat swell and ulcerate, choking the sufferer to death. 21-year-old Irene Rudolph, who had undergone several surgeries and blood transfusions, had died. And one particular worker, Frances Spletstocker, had died from necrosis of the jaw that had bored a hole right through her cheek. Marguerite Carlaw, who was still working at the studio, developed such a severe toothache her face swelled up, and she was really glad that sometime in late 1923 they finally started to advise the women to stop using the lip pointing technique, claiming the acid in their saliva broke down the adhesive. She couldn't eat, so she didn't relish the idea of putting a brush in her. She was suffering from fatigue and was pale and weak. Starting to sound familiar? When she left work on December 24th of 1923, she went straight to the dentist, who advised that 2 teeth should be immediately extracted. When the dentist pulled the teeth, a piece of her jawbone came out. 24-year-old Grace Fryer, a name synonymous with the plight of the Ghost Girls, was feeling tired and achy. She had left USRC back in the spring of 1920 to work at a bank. In June of 1923, she had been suffering from a light case of rheumatism, but figured it would go away. Mostly she was fixated on the trouble in her mouth. She'd gone for a checkup and the dentist removed 2 teeth. It became infected, but eventually cleared up. Then, not 6 months later, a hole opened up at the extraction site, oozing pus. In January, Grace went to the hospital to consult about her pain. The doctor diagnosed muscle-bound feet and chronic arthritis. He strapped her up for several weeks, but noticed little improvement. I wonder why. Catherine Shaw, Irene Rudolph's cousin, who is now 24, had watched the suffering and painful death of her cousin and decided something had to be done. She filed a report with the Department of Health the day after Irene's funeral. She told them everything that had happened to Irene, everything she knew about what had happened to Molly Maggia, and what little she knew of the other women who were suffering similar aches and pains. Catherine herself was starting to have trouble with her teeth and was terrified knowing how the story had ended for Irene and several of her friends. She said the United States Radium Corporation was the connection all these women had, and they were using a technique called lip pointing, and she was sure that that was the cause of all their problems. With her report filed, she hoped something would be done. USRC stated her claims were untrue when pressed, and that was apparently satisfactory for the Department of Health. In January of 1924, with the help of a local dentist, Dr. Barry, the women began to discuss their conditions. Finally, they were talking to each other. They were basically a big old toothless family. Dr. Barry refused to pull any more of Marguerite Carlaw's teeth, or anyone else's teeth, as he had linked the idea that with every operation to remove a tooth or a portion of the jaw, the infection became worse. He thought the best thing at this point was to manage the pain palliatively, but not to go digging for fear of further damage. An oral surgeon in New York, Dr. Bloom, was treating Hazel Vincent, now Hazel Cuser, and while he had never seen anything like her case before, he observed her jaw to be seemingly moth-eaten. It was riddled with holes. His provisional diagnosis was poisoning from a radioactive substance. It was Hazel's mother who stepped up to the plate. She could no longer watch her daughter suffer constant agony. Dr. Bloom said there was no chance of recovery. The Vincent Cusers had nothing to lose. Mrs. Vincent went down to the studio and left a letter stating she intended to make a claim for compensation on account of her daughter's illness. USRC, who had been consistently losing employees by now and having production held up due to the inability to replace the women who were quitting due to the rumors that the deaths were linked to the paint, had finally had enough. They decided to launch an investigation of their own into the lies and rumors being spread. It was starting to hurt business, after all. USRC contacted Dr. Cecil K. Drinker, a professor of physiology at the Harvard School of Public Health, a qualified MD, and a recognized authority in occupational disease. They asked if he and his wife, Dr. Catherine Drinker, would conduct a study at the New Jersey plant. Between May 7th and 8th of 1924, a full study took place. The doctors, fully read up on radium literature, conducted a detailed investigation. First, meeting with chief chemist Dr. Edwin Leman, they noted he had lesions on his hands, though he scoffed at the possibility of future and further damage.
Oh, stupid man.
They carried out thorough medical exams on 25 of the women, probing mouth, throats, checking teeth, and drawing blood. Then the women were ushered into the darkroom, where Catherine Drinker was able to perform a more intimate exam to determine to what degree the women were luminous. The Drinkers also visited Dr. Barry, the tooth extractor, and they met with several of the dial painters exhibiting symptoms. It would take them only 5 weeks to complete their report, a report that concluded that it was exposure to continuous doses of radium that was causing the women's health problem. They recommended immediate safety precautions. But the vice president chose to only acknowledge and share with the Department of Labor the blood test results of the workers, which showed their blood to be practically normal. Whatever that means. The Department of Labor agreed that the table showed everyone was in perfect condition and cleared the company of any responsibility. Mrs. Vincent's request for financial compensation was denied. Even had the company proved liable, there was a statute of limitations in play. New Jersey had a new law that made industrial diseases compensable, but only 9 diseases were on the permitted list, and the statute of limitations was 5 months of the point of injury. Not only was radium poisoning not recognized, but most of the girls who were suffering had not been employed with USRC within the last 5 months. The Drinkers' actual lengthy report declared that there was ample evidence of the dangers of overexposure, and the only ingredient of the luminous material which can do harm must be the radium. They noted radium had a similar chemical nature to calcium, thus radium, if ingested, might have a preference for bone as a final point of fixation. The radium had disguised itself as calcium to deposit directly into the bones of the dial painters. Once in the bones, it would create damage much greater than the same amount would from the outside. The doctors did indeed include a table of their test results of the workers and wrote no blood from the USRC employees was entirely normal. While some employees had marked changes in their blood and some had practically normal, no woman had wholly normal blood. Not even a dial painter who had only been on the job for 2 weeks. The Drinkers even expressed direct concern for Marguerite Carla, saying her current distressing condition was due to the years of work at the studio, and she needed the best of medical attention if she was to survive. Almost a year later, the company had done nothing to help her or any of the women. The report concluded with safety recommendations that Drinker insisted should be set in place at once. But it was all tucked away into a drawer. Not forgotten, just ignored. By July of 1924, Catherine Schaub was in further agony. She couldn't stay at a job for very long, and she developed severe anxiety. She'd had another tooth pulled, and when that didn't heal, she decided to seek higher expertise. She found Dr. Blum, who was also caring for Hazel Cuser. On one of Catherine's many visits, she ran into Hazel, who was unrecognizable. A new side effect was making itself known. Grotesque facial swelling, literal footballs of fluid sprouting from their jaws. Hazel would die that December at the age of 25. Her body was so ravaged and distorted by the illness, her family wouldn't allow anyone to see her at the funeral. During the winter of 1925, Marguerite Carla continued to suffer, and the more she suffered, the angrier she became. All she had given to USRC, and they did nothing to help or repay her. On February 5th, 1925, she found a lawyer to take up her case. She filed suit against the United States Radium Corporation for $75,000, approximately $1 million today. Marguerite was still an employee when she first became ill, and so her lawsuit, while filed 13 months after she had left USRC, was going through the federal court, which had a more generous 2-year statute. By spring of 1925, Marguerite was practically down from the infection of her facial bones. Her lower jaw was fractured on the right side of her face, and most of her teeth were missing. Her head was rotting. It was this sight that served the founder of USRC, Sabin von Sahaki, who had been unceremoniously booted from the company in 1921, to help. He had Marguerite admitted to the hospital to find out what was wrong with her. Upon admittance, she was anemic and weighed 90 pounds. A study by a Dr. Hoffman Hoffman, investigating the women's deaths, had recently been published by the American Medical Association. It publicly stated that the women's illnesses were connected to their work. The women were slowly being poisoned as a result of introducing into the system minute quantities of radioactive substance. Hoffman realized it wasn't the amount that was the problem, it was the cumulative effect of the ingestion of it through lip pointing. The most sinister aspect of the affliction is that the disease is apparently latent for several years before it manifests. Dr. Hoffman and Sahaki were both mystified by the lack of other cases. For USRC, it was clear evidence that the illness was not occupational. In Europe, dial painting had been perfected over the last decade, and they were using glass rods, small Q-tip-like applicators, sharpened wooden styluses, or metal needles. Nowhere else but in America was the technique of lip pointing being used. There were also only 3 major radium paint users in the US at this time. 1, USRC, founded in 1914 in New York with their studio in New Jersey. 2, the Waterbury Clock Company, founded in 1877 but only began to use radium paint around 1917. And 3, the Radium Dial Company, founded in 1919, painting by 1920. With the knowledge that radium poisoning took its time before displaying symptoms, it makes sense that there wouldn't be loads of other cases to draw from. Well, that, and the fact that the women who were dying were all being labeled as syphilitic whores. Oh, you. History. The patriarchy.